It is so good to see you this morning. So good to have a chance to worship God with you today. And as you know, we've been going over the spiritual war that we're involved in. And if you look over in Ephesians chapter 6, it talks about some of the things that we've been teaching for a while. It talks about the things that we've been discussing and that we've been going over. We talked about the armor, and we've just finished up talking about the armor. And it mentions in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11, put on the full armor of God. It mentions in verse 13, take up the whole armor of God. So it mentions the armor. That's why we've been talking about it. It's not just enough to talk about. We've got to make sure we're wearing it. And then the reason why is because of verse 11, that we may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. So we've talked about our adversary. We know his schemes. It's not that we're not aware of it. And his assault. Because we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, there in verse 12. So it's not just the adversary, the devil, it's also his helpers. And so we know there's the assault going on because the schemes of the devil. And we've talked about what we're supposed to do. And we've talked about putting on the whole armor. Well, today we're going to talk about what the army is. The army really is the church. That's us right here. We're supposed to all have the armor on. We're supposed to all be protected and be wearing it. It talks about the activities of the army, or of the armor. Of the army. It says in verse 12, it says we're supposed to wrestle. This is not something that's easy. This is something that's difficult because we have Satan who is sitting there tempting us with all kinds of temptations, with all kinds of lies that we believe. And so we have to wrestle. And it's not that we're wrestling against people. We're wrestling against the spiritual. Those things that are trying to get us, those spiritual powers that are trying to get us and take us down. It talks about in verse 13, that we can withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand firm. So it talks about how we're supposed to withstand. It talks about how we're supposed to stand firm in verse 13. In verse 14, it says we're supposed to stand. And then in verse 20, it says, Paul says, I'm an ambassador in chains. And so as an army, we're supposed to be ambassadors. There's an acrostic that you have on your notes. And it spells out army. And so as we look at it, we're going to look at what that spells out. But this is, whether it's internal or whether it's external, it's all spiritual. It's these things that we have to fight on a regular basis. There's an attitude that we should have. We should be relying on Christ, on the supplied armor that he gives us. And we should ensure that the family, that means all of us, is wearing the armor as well. Sometimes it's easy to wear some types of armor that he talks about when he talks about truth and righteousness and the gospel and faith and the salvation, the word of God. It's easy to sometimes pick out that someone else isn't wearing that. It's a little bit difficult to think that we aren't armored up all the time. But we need to make sure that each other, including ourselves, has the armor on all the time. This isn't something where it's a suggestion. It's not just hey, this would be a really good benefit for you. This says put on the whole armor. There's no suggestion. This is a command. We're supposed to use every ounce of equipment that we have at our disposal that he's given us to make sure we're defending and we're fighting against the schemes of the devil. So our attitude must be right. And it says the actions, it's all written out here. It says to stand. Now, it says when you've done everything to stand, you're supposed to stand. So in other words, when you've done everything you can, and it feels like it's just no use, you still have to do just as Job did. When all these things come at you, you're still supposed to stand. And we need to, as an army, we need to make sure each other is standing. And that we're standing beside each other. That should be encouraging for us. But also the aim is that we all remain standing, no matter what. That we don't ever take a break, that we're all still standing, we remain standing, and we continue standing. That means we're faithful. So for the first thing, Ambassador of Christ. That's what we are. We're the ambassador of Christ. It talks about in verse 20, Paul says, I am an ambassador in chains. Now, he is writing this from prison. He's lost his freedoms, or his freedom. He's lost that. And all the different freedoms that would go with being incarcerated. He is in prison and he's writing this and he says, I'm an ambassador in chains. He is saying, I'm a representative no matter where I'm at. And I'm here in prison, I'm a representative of Christ. And if he was at work, he would say, I'm an ambassador at work. If he was at home, he'd say, I'm an ambassador at home for Christ. I am an ambassador. I'm a representative no matter where I go. So if I'm going to the store, if I'm going across the street, if I'm going to some activity, wherever I am, I'm bringing Christ with me. And as Christians, if we bring Christ with us, that means we represent on a regular basis. So we don't have to worry about someone falling away from the example that we're setting. It's supposed to bring people to us. The words we say, the actions that we have, all should be a representative of who he is, because it's no longer I live, but it's Christ living in me. I should be imitating him so much that people see that there's a difference, and that they talk about it as what they mentioned to those in Acts, where they said, is obviously spent time with Christ. That's the way it should be with us, that we have spent so much time with him, we look just like him. It talks about in 2 Corinthians, we're the aroma of Christ. We're the letter of Christ. We should be that. We should be exuding Christ always. Even when we're mad, even when we're upset, even when we're disappointed, even when we're discouraged, we should be representing Christ. We are the ambassadors of Christ. And it talks about this, and if I'm going to bring it up, I've got to mention 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where it talks about how in verse 14 it says, Christ's love controls or compels us. So I've mentioned before, and this is a great time to mention again, when you fall in love with someone, man, you're all in. You can't help stop thinking and talking and wanting to be around them. And when we're in love with Christ, we can't help but want to talk about him. We can't help but become like him. And we can't help but do what he says. We don't have a disagreement. We don't have I really like a lot of the commandments that Jesus offers, but I really don't like this one, so I'm going to leave this one out. It may be difficult, but we still do it because we're in love with Christ. Christ's love, it says controls in my version. Some says compels us. Man, I've got no choice in the matter. Because I love him, I'm going to do that. I had a choice to become a Christian, but now I am one. There's no choice. It's whatever he says. I'm going to do it because I know he has my best interest in mind. And so his love compels us. And it talks about in verse 18 that we have this ministry of reconciliation because we are his ambassadors. So we're trying to get other people to be reconciled, to be back together with Christ. And not only that, in verse 19, it says in verse 19, we have this message of reconciliation. So we got this ministry, and the ministry that we have is to tell this message to everyone. Because the aspect is we have a mission there in verse 20. We are the ambassadors of Christ. So we have something to tell. We have a ministry, we have a message, and we have this mission. And everybody is a part of it. The whole army of Christ. We all have this mission. And it's about our attitude, our action, our aim. The world's watching and evaluating us. And so if they judge Christianity based off the way we live, is it going to be attractive to them? It just makes me think of when I had a conversation actually with a young man. I said, well, what made you change? Because you weren't living this way before. And he said that the lady that he was engaged to made Christianity attractive. And he wanted to be that way. And so he became faithful. And in turn, they became engaged and are married to this day. Because it's all about him realizing who she represented. And he wanted to represent that too. We have to make sure the armor's worn. It can't just be worn at certain times when it's convenient. It has to be worn all the time. Last week we talked about how David, he was most susceptible right there in his kingdom, right there in the palace as he was in the battlefield, because he had all the armor on in the battlefield. And sometimes we think that, well, when we're at the house, we don't have to worry about the spiritual armor. Or when I'm at certain places, maybe here worshiping, I don't have to worry about the spiritual armor because I'm around all the people that are like-minded. He didn't say take it off. We've got to be geared up, ready at all times, because I have been amazed at the times growing up and even now, the people that discourage you and persuade you to do something else oftentimes come from within, comes from the church. And so they tempt you to do different things you wouldn't normally do. But if you get your armor on, all of a sudden you're encouraging them to put their armor back on instead of tempting you in ways you shouldn't be tempted. We see that being an ambassador of Christ is about moving forward, not moving away. We run to the fight. We don't run away from it. As ambassadors of Christ, we're trying to tell the whole world that there's a better way to live. One where you can have peace and joy no matter what the circumstance. And so you look at in Acts chapter 5, you see the ambassadorship taking place. In chapter 5, verse 18, it says they were arrested. They arrested the apostles and they put them in public prison. Man, what a deal. But you see in verse 28, they filled Jerusalem with the teaching. So knowing that, they fill Jerusalem with the teaching, they are being ambassadors no matter whether it's good or bad, no matter whether they have their freedom and all their rights or not. So it doesn't matter if our government takes our rights away. They can't take our faith away. We're the only ones that kind of remove that. We're the only ones that put that shield down and say, we'll save it for another day. So we've got an amazing thing. Talking about ambassadors, they filled up Jerusalem. And then if you go to Acts chapter 8, once Stephen is killed, when he's murdered, it says in verse 4, they go off and it says wherever they were scattered, they preached the word. That's exactly what they were doing. They were being ambassadors for Christ, which is exactly what he said before he ascended. Jesus, that is. In Matthew chapter 28, Matthew chapter 28, 19 and 20, it talks about going to all the world. Be an ambassador of Christ. That's why we have it as you go out this building. It says now you're entering the mission field. Because that's what this is all about. It's about us being ambassadors for Christ. We can see that example in Acts chapter 8. When you see Philip, he's teaching someone that people thought less than. He's teaching a Samaritan. You see all these different things. You see in Acts chapter 9, you see a murderer being taught. You see in chapter 10, you see an occupier that's being taught. A Roman soldier. A centurion. And then in chapter 16, you see Paul teaching foreigners. And so as he's there in Philippi, so you see all these different ways, people being ambassadors of Christ. And then the next, the R, is to resist Satan. That means to stand firm. That means to be faithful. It says in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13, it says, and having done all to stand, stand. There's no choice. There's no sitting down. There's no relaxing. It's about us going and taking it on to Christ, to Satan. Because if we're ambassadors of Christ, we're going to resist Satan. We have a choice. We either ambassadors for him or we give in to Satan. So if we either resist or we choose not to resist and we choose to go along with Satan. And so here, the army is an ambassador of Christ. The army resists, and we resist all the time. In Colossians chapter 3, 17 and 23, it says, everything you do it for the Lord. Whatever your hand finds to do, you do with all your might. Not working for men, but working for the Lord. It's who we represent. We're going to resist him all the time because we're working for the Lord. We see these examples of standing, of resisting in Acts chapter 4. You see it when in verse 19 it says, Peter and John, when they're arrested, they say, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than God, you must judge. But for we cannot speak about what we've seen and heard. We're going to have to resist because we are compelled by Christ's love to tell. In chapter 5, they sit there and they're told once again, they're warned not to talk any about it. And in verse 29, Peter and the apostles, they all together answer, we must obey God rather than man. They're resisting. Because it would be easy to go along. It'd be easy to sit down and shut up and be silent instead of standing up and speaking up. And so right there, they know exactly what the cost is. They know it has potential of costing their life. And it's exactly a few chapters later what it's going to cost Stephen when he stood up and spoke up. We've got to be faithful no matter what. We've got to be faithful no matter the external. And you think about that. We have to be faithful. We have to resist no matter if our spouse is wanting us not to be faithful. Even if our spouse is trying to say, hey, let's go do something else besides worship. Let's go do something else. If they don't even have to say, they don't even have to persuade you. But by them not wanting to do what Christ says, you know you've got the example in the house and it becomes discouraging. We've got to make sure we're resisting no matter what. And you kids, you young people at school, you've got to make sure you're resisting Satan. Because they say it in certain easy ways. I see it all the time in school. It's not just a blatant disregard, but it's certain small things. For instance, if the teacher tells you to put your phone up, you put your phone up. You don't sit there and sneak it around like other students do because you're different. You're a Christian. And you resist that temptation. You look at all across, they're just small things. But all it is, they can become big things. You see, in life, we can look at it and that speed limit sign, it says speed limit, right? Not speed suggestion. That's the limit. It says speed limit, and it gives you a certain limit right there. And I know you're looking around because you're thinking, man, has you been watching me drive? Because that right there, it's a small thing. And I know I'm handling myself. I've got to, I'm doing it all right. I tell my kids to do the 10 and 2, but I don't have to do 10 and 2. I'm good. And we teach these things, small things, but then sometimes we don't do those small things. When it says, you may not necessarily be where the police are going to pull you over for not doing 10 and 2, but they'll pull you over for not doing the limit. If you're going beyond the limit, and then what example are we setting? It's the small things that he grabs us. We've got to make sure resisting. We've got to make sure that we're standing at all times, in all ways. And you think about, we've got to be faithful because people are looking at us. We've got to be faithful in our job. You think about that. We've got to make sure we're resisting Satan in our job. You think about the different things. I was, sometimes where I'm at, they have some extra things, extra cups for people to get coffee and things like that. But that's there. It was given to the school to stay at the school. But if I go and I take one home, well, they've got plenty. They're not going to miss this one. I'm not resisting Satan. I'm letting him tempt me because I'm trying to take the easy way out. And that's usually the path of least resistance gets us in trouble. That's what water does. It takes the path of least resistance, and if we do the same thing and we don't resist Satan, he just keeps coming at us. But we know we have a promise. If we resist, that he takes off fleeing there from James chapter 4. That we need to make sure that we're doing that. You think about standing and resisting. They had to stand and resist against the Jews of that day that wished them harm, that wanted to kill them. And they also had to resist against the Roman Empire that came after trying to kill them as well. And they didn't sit there. We don't read that says any of them said, well, I think that I can still be faithful. It's not written here. These words that we have as scriptural, I can still be faithful if I just kind of half-heartedly obey. If I resist just at certain times. That's not what that's not what the spiritual army does. That's not why he gave us the armor. He gave us the armor to be an ambassador and to resist Satan. And the whole commandment is, when you start looking at commands, they aren't suggestions. He's commanded you to be faithful. He didn't command you to be successful. He's going to bring the success. He's going to bring the victory, as it talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He brings the victory. We're living in the day of victory. He's already brought about the victory. He doesn't say you have to be successful in everything you do. He just says you need to be faithful in everything you do. That's why grace comes in. Because he knows you can't always. And that you're going to have struggles. But he said, get back on it and live for me. And the M in Army is minister to needs. Minister to needs. That means we see a need. We need to be able to go and meet that need. You know, faith is not stationary. It's not something that the army of the Lord should be stationary. We should be on the move on a regular basis. We should be seeing the people that need help, and we ought to be able to minister and care for the other people. Because we ought to see them as a creation of God. And we ought to see them as an opportunity to be able to help others. We are the arm of Christ in this world. In Ephesians chapter 6, 18 and 19 talks about the supplication made for all the saints. It's ministering to their needs in prayer as we go to God. But there's so many different ways of helping our neighbor, of being able to serve our neighbor and loving our neighbor. One of them would be to have the gospel shared to them. And you see in Acts, you see in chapter 2, when needs were met. It says in verse 45, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Not that you had want, but you had need. They were going to make sure the needs were taken care of. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to make sure we care for people's needs. Because if I'm going to try to reach out to somebody, they may not want to listen until I meet that need. Their stomach is going to be hungry and it's going to be roaring. They may not have the concentration to listen to the gospel unless their stomach is filled. And so I need to be able to meet the need. I need to be able to help other people. And you see in chapter 4, verse 34, it says, there was not a needy person among them. For as many of the owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. And they laid at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. Not one, as you had a need. So it wasn't a handout just to give you extra. It was, I'm helping fulfill the need. That's what we're talked about. It talks about that in chapter 6. You see the first group here is being overlooked. You see people that are widows, that are Greek widows, they're being overlooked. And so they set up and said, hey, let's make sure we're feeding them and we're taking care of their need so they're not neglected. And they took care of the need. You see all the way through, if you looked in Acts chapter 21, there's a need there in Jerusalem. It mentions this, that Paul goes there and he talks about when he is captured, he talks about this and arrested. He talks about it in Acts chapter 24, why he was there. He was giving alms to his people. It mentions that in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 13. He was helping. The church got all this money collected because the church there was having problems in Jerusalem. He gave it to them, but also by inspiration, it says that what he did also with this money, he gave to the people that were Jews in Jerusalem because he gave it to people that needed it. And so there was one man that said, man, I can't believe that you're so liberal. You know, you've become liberal these days. And he said, well, I don't know. How did you know how much I was given? Because, you know, you got a person saying you're liberal in your beliefs. And he's saying, well, you've been looking at my contribution then. So you're supposed to be quiet. In other words, he was twisting it back on them saying, no, it's not the fact that I'm liberal. I want to give. I want to help. And sometimes we get so close-minded on what we should do. We don't help other people. And we can come up with rules and regulations to help people. But when it comes down to it, the army is supposed to minister to the needs of others. That's not just physical. It's also spiritual. It's both. We've got to make sure we're caring for the person physically and the person spiritually. Because if I'm sitting there and I'm just teaching the gospel and you don't have a roof over your head and you don't have a jacket in the cold weather, it's going to be difficult for you to understand that I am Christ in the flesh trying to help you become like Christ because I'm trying to imitate him. And we see plenty of examples of him going to people and helping. We need to make sure that we're doing the same thing. Not only that, But the Y in army is yield to Christ. It's submission. And submission is not a suggestion. Submission as a Christian is necessary. It says in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11, it says, put on the whole armor of God. It mentions in verse 13, therefore take up the whole armor of God. It says in verse 13 also to stand firm. It says in verse 14 to stand. We're supposed to yield to him. When he says to do these things, we're supposed to do them. He's supposed to take the lead and we're supposed to follow. We're supposed to yield. And that's so opposite of what our country teaches. Our country teaches that it's us in charge and we need to tell other people how to do things. But that's not what Christ says. Christ says yield. Christ says submit. The study that we've been talking about on Sunday mornings, we've been going through Ephesians, and one of them was Ephesians chapter 5, 22 and following. Every relationship piece is about submission. And it's interesting because we see the same type of submission in the Trinity, in God the Son, God the Father, and God the Spirit. We see the same thing. In Matthew 26, verse 39, he says, not my will, but yours be done. Submission. The Son is submitting to the Father. It says in Philippians chapter 2, 2 through 5, he became a servant. He humbled himself and became a servant. He's submitting to the Father. And it shows he's submitting to us because he came as a servant here to us. It talks about that servitude there in John chapter 13. The submission where he's washing everybody's feet. And then he says, go and do likewise. Be a servant to other people. Be submissive to other people. Yield to Christ. We see the same type of submission in the Spirit. It says that he is brought to glorify. He is brought to glorify the Son. So if he's glorifying the Son, he's submitting himself, not glorifying the Spirit and glorifying himself. He's glorifying Christ. It mentions all that all the way through. When you see John chapter 14 and 16, it's talking about him glorifying. He will come when Jesus leaves and he will glorify the Son. He's showing submission. We see submission in the Father, where in chapter 28 of Matthew, verse 18, it says, all authority and power has been given. He's been given those things, and so the Father steps back and he submits to the Son. All power and authority has been given to the Son. We see all the way through, and it talks about how we're supposed to submit to each other. It says that if you go to James, it talks about how we are supposed to submit to him. Look in James chapter 4, verse 7. It says, submit therefore to God. Submit yourselves therefore to God. We see God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit submitting to each other in different aspects. It says we're supposed to submit to God. And it says we're supposed to resist the devil and watch him flee, watch him run scared. And so for us, we see the examples. Matter of fact, you see Paul. He was brought up, Gamaliel was his teacher, was his rabbi. He would have been the prominent person if you want to be trained and taught. It says that he was trained under this guy. This would have been the Harvard of Judaism. He was trained under this man. He had an easy life. But then all of a sudden he trades it all in. And you see in Acts chapter 9, it says, I'm going to show him. He's an instrument of righteousness. I'm going to show him what he must do to suffer. How he's going to suffer. And then we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, all the ways that he struggles as he's being faithful. The persecution that he has to endure, the threats on his life, the attempted suicides on, the attempted murder, all these things. How he didn't have some of his needs met. How he said, I was hungry and I was thirsty in different times. How I didn't have clothes. And so we know it was difficult for him. And through the suffering, through the sacrifice, you see the first century is scattered. Through all that, we're supposed to yield to Christ. And through all that, Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. And he's in prison for the sake of Christ in Ephesians as he's writing. And he's still saying, I'm ambassador of Christ in chains. I can still be his ambassador. So it doesn't matter the situation. It doesn't matter what you're going through right now. You can still be his ambassador. You can still resist Satan no matter what is in your path, no matter who lives in your home, no matter who you work with, no matter who you go to school with. You can still resist. And you can still minister to the needs of others, no matter what. You can meet their needs. And if you aren't able financially to do that, there's a whole lot in the army that is able to. And we collect our money together, and we can help a whole lot of folks. And you look, and Christ, man, they left everything. They left everything at different times. When you look at Luke 5, it says they left everything and they followed him. They left everything. They yielded to Christ. Christ was put in his proper place. And so you look at that in your life. You think about what's most important. You think about what the most important thing is. And the thing that you talk about, the thing that you spend all your time doing is the most important thing. And so what is that? Some people chase health, thinking that's the end-all be-all. And they have all these products and all these different things. They're trying to be youthful forever. Some people chase money, and they're always looking for the next thing to make some more money. Some people chase possessions, so they're always accumulating things. They're always having, there's a new latest version, they're getting it. Some people chase entertainment, so they're always going and doing, they're always visiting, they're always seeing, they're always experiencing. That's their God. Some people, it's all about their family, so they spend all their time with their family and none with God. Sometimes it's about their spouse, so everything is devoted to that spouse and nothing to God. Sometimes it's their own self-interest. It's all about themselves. They accumulate. And I know as a single person, you can get in that situation where it's about you and not about anybody else. And so you need to make sure to evaluate to see if that's the case. Some people, it's intellect. And so it's always about how smart they are and how many letters they have behind their name, in front of their name, wherever they put them in their name. And they got to let you know that they know the answer to everything. They're always, if you have a suggestion, they've got a better one. Put Christ in his proper place. Make him the God of your life instead of all these other things. If there's anything else that takes precedence, then that's your God, not the God. It's interesting. In Colossians 3, he talks about some things. And for us, yielding to Christ involves the word, it involves worship, and it involves work. And you can see these things in Colossians chapter 3. It says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom. So we're supposed to yield to the word of Christ. And it says, worship, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your heart to God. So he should be the focus. It's an audience of one. He should be the focus of our worship. We should be thankful in our hearts to him. And then it talks about our work. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God our Father through him. So when we submit, when we're being submissive to Christ, it involves focusing on his word. It involves worshiping the way he's commanded. It involves working. If we're just sitting there studying and worshiping and there's no work behind it, we haven't yielded. We haven't submitted to him. We can only do one of two things. We can either submit to Satan or we can submit to the Savior. That's the choice. That's the only choice we've got. And as an army, as a church, he says, I need you to be my ambassador. I need you to resist Satan. I need you to minister to the needs here and abroad. I need you to be able to yield to me. That's what he wants. He says, he gives a promise. If you submit to me, that means you're resisting him. And if you resist Satan, he's going to run. And so who are you submitting to? What has power over you? It comes out in your conversation, what the things you're most interested in. And that ends up, a lot of times, politics, especially during this time, politics, money, especially during this time. We see inflation going up and people focus on the outside instead of the inside. Sex, we see all different types of perversions going on. Pride, sometimes work, we just so focused and dialed in on that. Sometimes it's our hobbies, we spend more time with our hobbies. Sometimes entertainment. But what are you submitting to? If it's anything other than Christ, you need to make an about face. Whatever your need, we need to know so we can be praying for you. You don't have to get in specifics. I don't want you to feel embarrassed that you can't sit there and ask for prayers. But if you need us to be praying for you, let us know that we need to be praying for you. And if there's something specific, let us know that. But if you haven't put Christ on baptism, as it talks about in Galatians chapter 3, 26 and 27, you put him on in baptism because you have to have faith and you have to be baptized. And you put him on. Let us know what we need to do. Because it's not enough to walk out of here needing to do some things and you put it off. Don't put it off. Put Christ on. But whatever you need, please come when we stand.